There is a legal concept called an easement that most homeowners know exists in the same vague way they know that terms like encumbrance and covenant exist, present somewhere in the stack of documents they signed at closing, relevant in some theoretical sense to the property they own, but not something they ever expect to need to understand in any practical depth. Easements are the kind of thing that matters in textbooks and title searches and the quiet background machinery of property law, not in daily life, not in the actual lived experience of owning a house and going about your business on your own land. Until someone blocks yours. Then you learn everything there is to know about easements very quickly and with a level of attention that no classroom could have produced, because the classroom does not have the same motivating quality as standing at the end of your own property in the early morning with a cup of coffee in your hand looking at a locked gate that was not there yesterday on a road that has been your legal right of access for 31 years. My name is Leonard Briggs. I am 58 years old and I have owned the property on the eastern end of HOAHOA Lane for 9 years. I did not find the property myself. My uncle Gerald found it. Gerald Briggs had owned that land for 22 years before his health declined to the point where maintaining a rural property was no longer practical, and when he decided to sell, he offered it to family first, and I was the one who said yes. The property is 11 acres at the end of a private lane. The lane, HOAHOA Lane, is approximately 900 feet long and connects my property to the county road that is the nearest public thoroughfare. The lane runs through land that is owned by the HOAHOA Estates HOA, which is the homeowners association for the residential development that was built on either side of the lane in the mid-90s, about 10 years after my uncle purchased his parcel. This is the critical point, and I want to state it clearly because everything else in this story depends on understanding it. My property's access to the public road runs through HOA-controlled land. The lane itself is HOA maintained, but my right to use that lane is not a courtesy. It is not a neighborly arrangement. It is not something the HOA permits because they happen to feel agreeable about it. It is an easement. A recorded, legally established, county-registered easement that has existed since before the HOAHOA Estates development was built, that was established by my Uncle Gerald as a condition of allowing the development to proceed across land that surrounded his parcel, and that runs with the land in perpetuity regardless of who owns either the dominant or the servient estate. In plain language, my right to drive down HOAHOA Lane is the law. It has been the law for 31 years. It is not negotiable, not by the HOA, not by the development, not by any resident or board or committee or administrator. The HOA put a gate across it anyway. I need to give you the background on the HOA situation before I describe the gate, because the gate did not come out of nowhere. It came out of 18 months of escalating conflict that I had tried to resolve through reasonable means, and that had been responded to with increasingly unreasonable actions by the HOAHOA Estates HOA board. The HOA had been functioning without major incident for the 15 years between the development's construction and my purchase of Gerald's property. Gerald had been a largely absent landowner, using the property occasionally as a retreat but not living there, not developing it, not requiring daily use of the lane. His access needs were minimal and intermittent, and the HOA had basically forgotten about the easement the way people forget about things that never create friction. When I bought the property and moved in as a full-time resident, the daily use of the lane became visible in a way it had not been before. I drove it twice a day at minimum, more often when work required, and occasionally more than that with visitors and deliveries and the normal traffic of a household. This was not excessive. This was the use the easement was designed to support. But it was more than the HOA had been accustomed to seeing, and it became, gradually, an irritant to certain residents who lived in houses along the lane and who had apparently come to think of the lane as more exclusively their own than it actually was. The first indication of friction was a letter from the HOA board in my second year of residence. The letter said the HOA had received concerns from residents about traffic on HOAHOA Lane and asked me to minimize my use of the lane to essential trips only. It did not define essential. It did not cite any legal basis for the request. It was written in the tone of an administrative body that was accustomed to compliance and had not considered that the person receiving the letter might have a legal right that was not subject to minimization at the HOA's request. I wrote back. I explained the easement, cited the recording information, and noted that my use of the lane was within my legal rights and would continue as my household required. I kept the response professional and brief. The HOA's response was to escalate. Over the following months, they sent 3 more letters, each slightly more insistent than the last, each requesting that I limit my use of the lane without any legal basis for the request and without acknowledging the existence or terms of the easement. I responded to each one with the same patient explanation. The easement exists. The access is my legal right. The use will continue as required. Then they hired a property manager named Celia Vance. Celia had been brought in, I learned through conversations with a few Harwick Estates residents who were not hostile to my situation, specifically to deal with what the HOA board described as the access road issue. She arrived with the energy of someone who had been given a mandate and the specific blind confidence of someone who did not know enough about easement law to understand why the mandate was legally impossible to achieve. She sent me a formal access policy document. It stated that use of Harwick Lane was subject to HOA approval for each trip exceeding a specified frequency. It required me to submit monthly logs of my lane use. It imposed a schedule of permitted hours during which I could use the lane and hours during which I could not. It stated that non-compliance would result in access restrictions. I forwarded the document to my attorney, a woman named Claire Hutchins, who had handled the property purchase and who knew the easement documentation thoroughly. She called me within an hour of receiving it. She said, "Leonard, this document is legally incoherent." I said, "Tell me what you mean." She said an easement holder's right of access cannot be conditioned, scheduled, or logged by the servient estate. The HOA does not have the authority to impose access hours, trip frequency limits, or reporting requirements on your use of your own easement. This document is not a valid policy. It is a piece of paper that someone wrote without understanding what an easement is. I said, "What do I do with it?" She said, "I will respond formally, and I want to send a copy of the easement recording and a summary of the applicable law to the HOA board and their attorney, if they have one, so that we are operating with the same facts." I said, "Do it." She sent the formal response. The HOA received it. Their attorney, a man named Paul Garrett, who practiced general HOA law and who I suspect had not previously encountered a situation involving a pre-existing easement from before the development's existence, apparently advised the board that Claire was correct and that the access policy was not enforceable. The HOA board did not abandon the effort. They changed tactics. The tactics shifted from formal policy to informal obstruction. The lane began to be maintained in ways that were technically within the HOA's authority as lane maintainers, but that had the practical effect of making my travel more difficult. Speed bumps appeared, 3 of them, installed without any prior notice. They were built to a height that required me to slow to approximately 5 miles per hour to cross without jarring my vehicle significantly. When I asked about them, Claire looked up the applicable standards and told me they were within the legal height limit for private road traffic control, but at the very top of that limit. Then the resurfacing. The HOA repaved the lane and in doing so narrowed the effective driving surface on 2 sections by installing raised curbing that had the effect of making the lane functional for the smaller vehicles of most residents, but tight for my truck. My truck is a standard full-size pickup, nothing unusual. But on the narrowed sections, I had to drive with care to keep from clipping the curbing. Then the lighting, or rather the lack of it. The HOA removed 2 streetlights that had been positioned along the lane in locations that were most useful to my travel from the eastern end and replaced them with a single light positioned near the development entrance, which was useful to their residents but left the last 400 feet of the lane, the section I traveled most, significantly darker in the evenings. Each of these actions was technically within the HOA's authority over the maintained lane. Each of them was clearly, in context, targeted at my use. Claire documented all of them and sent a letter to the HOA attorney each time, noting the pattern and reserving our rights. The HOA attorney responded each time with letters that were legally competent and carefully avoided any language that could be characterized as acknowledging the targeting. This went on for 14 months. I want to be honest about what those 14 months were like. I am a patient man. I have been described as patient by people who know me, and I think it is accurate. But patience has a weight, and 14 months of navigating a lane that was being deliberately made more difficult, of receiving formal letters that treated my legal right as something to be managed rather than respected, of watching my access to my own property be incrementally degraded by people who had decided that the fact of my legal right was an obstacle to be worked around. That weight accumulated. It accumulated in the way these things accumulate, not explosively but steadily, until one morning I stood at my end of the lane and looked at what they had done and thought clearly and without anger, enough. The gate went up 3 days later. It was a Monday. I had been away for a long weekend, a trip to visit my daughter in her city, and when I came back Sunday evening, I noticed something at the far end of the lane that I could not quite make out in the dark. Monday morning, I drove down to it. A gate, a substantial one, steel tube construction, chain link infill, mounted on concrete footings that had clearly been poured the previous week. A padlock on a chain. A small sign that said HARWICK Estates RESIDENTS only access by key card. There was no key card. There was no communication to me about the gate. No letter, no email, no knock on my door. The HOA had installed a gate across a lane on which I held a recorded easement and had not informed me it was coming, had not provided me with access, and had apparently decided that the sign saying residents only was a sufficient legal response to the fact that I was not a resident, but was an easement holder with a right of access that predated the entire development. I sat in my truck in front of that gate for a while. I called Claire. I told her what I was looking at. She was quiet for longer than I expected. Then she said, "Leonard, they have blocked a recorded easement. Do you understand what that means?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "Blocking a recorded easement is not a policy dispute. It is not a maintenance decision. It is not a technical violation. It is an illegal interference with a property right. It is actionable in ways that everything else they have done over the past 14 months has not been." I said, "What can we do?" She said, "We can seek an emergency injunction requiring immediate removal of the gate. We can file a civil suit for damages, including all costs associated with the obstruction. We can file a complaint with the county because the easement is a recorded county document and blocking it is a matter of public record concern. And Leonard, here is the thing I want you to understand right now." I said, "Tell me." She said, "They have given you leverage that you did not have before. Everything they did over the past 14 months was documented but defensible because it was within their technical authority. This gate is not defensible. This gate is illegal interference with a property right, and the response available to you now is proportionate to the seriousness of what they have done." I said, "What does proportionate look like?" She said, "What do you want, Leonard? Not just the gate gone. What do you actually want to come out of this entire situation?" I had thought about this, not in the previous 5 minutes. I had been thinking about it for 14 months in the way you think about things that have been grinding at you steadily. I had a clear answer. I said, "I want them to understand that this easement is not going to go away. Not through policies, not through lane modifications, not through gates. I want a formal resolution that makes future interference legally costly in a way that the HOA board and every future HOA board will remember. And I want the costs of everything they have done to me over the past 14 months recovered." Claire said, "All of those are achievable, but I want to add something." I said, "Tell me." She said, "The gate gives us the ability to go beyond just getting the gate removed. It gives us the ability to define your easement rights so specifically and formally that the HOA will have a documented legal framework they cannot work around in the future. I want to use this moment not just to fix the gate, but to establish something permanent. I said, how? She said, an easement clarification agreement, a recorded document filed with the county that specifies in precise terms the nature and extent of your access rights, the HOA's obligations as the servient estate, and the consequences of interference. Once that document is filed, every future HOA board, every future property manager, every future Celia Vance will have to live with it. I said, can we get that? She said, right now they have blocked a recorded easement illegally. They need the gate gone as fast as we need it gone, because every day it stands is a day they are in violation of a court order once we get the injunction. We have significant leverage for this negotiation. I said, file for the injunction. She said, it'll be in front of a judge by Thursday. I said, Claire, one more thing. While this is being resolved, while we are waiting for the injunction and the negotiation, I cannot get in and out of my property through the front. She said, I know. I said, is there anything I can do in the meantime that makes the situation real for them? Something legal, something that communicates that this is not going to be a quiet negotiation. She was quiet, then she said, Leonard, do you know what a toll is? I said, tell me what you're thinking. There is a section of my property that runs along the south side of the Harwick Estates development, not inside the development, along the outside boundary of it, a strip of my land approximately 200 feet long and 40 feet wide that abuts the development's southern edge, and that, I had established when purchasing the property, contained a recorded right-of-way granted to the development for utility access, a maintenance right-of-way. The development's utility easement ran through my land. Claire had flagged this during the purchase review as a minor servient easement on my property, something to be aware of, but not a practical concern given that utility access was infrequent and the right-of-way was clearly defined. I had noted it and filed it and not thought about it since. Until now. Claire said, the utility right-of-way gives the development access across your land for utility maintenance. It does not give them unlimited access. The right-of-way is for utility access specifically during reasonable hours with appropriate notice. I said, they use it. She said, how often? I said 3 or 4 times a year. Utility trucks, maintenance crews, they come through without notice, usually in the morning. She said, without notice. I said, yes. She said, Leonard, the right-of-way requires reasonable notice. It also, under the recorded terms I reviewed during your purchase, requires that the access be coordinated with the property owner to minimize disruption. They have been accessing your land without notice and without coordination. I said, which is technically a violation of the right-of-way terms. She said, yes. I said, so they have a right-of-way across my land that they have been using improperly, and I have an easement across their land that they have now blocked. She said, yes. I said, what happens if I enforce the right-of-way terms? She said, if you require advance notice and formal coordination for every utility access trip, and if you are permitted under the right-of-way terms to charge a reasonable administrative fee for coordination services when notice is not properly provided, which I believe you may be, then every unnoticed access trip by the development's utility crews becomes a billable event. I said, every trip. She said, every trip that does not comply with the notice and coordination requirements. I said, how often do they send utility crews? She said, that depends on the development's maintenance schedule. But if they have been accessing without notice regularly for 9 years, the current number is likely significant. I said, Claire. She said, Leonard. I said, how do I set this up? The formal notice was sent on a Wednesday. Claire drafted it on Tuesday. I reviewed it Tuesday evening, and it went out by certified mail on Wednesday morning to the HOA board, the property manager Celia Vance, and the development's utility contractor. The notice stated that the right-of-way across my property for utility access was subject to the recorded terms, which required advance notice of no less than 72 hours before any access, formal written coordination with the property owner, and that access without proper notice was a violation of the right-of-way terms. It stated that effective immediately, any access that did not comply with the notice and coordination requirements would be subject to an administrative coordination fee of $250 per access event, which represented the reasonable cost of managing uncoordinated access to private property. It also stated that a review of prior access records had identified multiple instances of uncoordinated access over the previous 9 years, and that documentation of these instances was being prepared for potential recovery. The notice went out Wednesday, the injunction application was filed Thursday, and on Thursday afternoon, while Claire was at the courthouse, I drove to a hardware store and bought several things. I bought survey flags, the bright orange ones, the kind that are visible from a significant distance. I spent Thursday afternoon walking the boundary of the right-of-way and placing a flag at every corner and at 20-foot intervals along the length of it, so that the precise boundaries of the access strip were clearly and undeniably marked on the ground. I also bought a simple digital counter, the kind used to count foot traffic, and mounted it on a post at the entry point of the right-of-way. The counter was not connected to anything. It was not a toll gate. It was not a barrier. It was a counter mounted on a post on my own property at the entry to the right-of-way, counting the number of access events. And I bought a portable sign stand, the kind used for parking lots and construction sites, and placed a sign at the right-of-way entry that said, "Private property." The sign was accurate. Every word of it was accurate. The right-of-way terms required notice. The fee had been established in the formal notice sent Wednesday. The counter counted. The flags marked the boundary. I stood back and looked at the setup. Then I went back to the main lane, which was still blocked by the gate I could not pass, and I looked at that too. I thought about Celia Vance receiving the certified letter. I thought about the HOA board being served with the injunction application. I thought about the utility contractor arriving for their next unnoticed maintenance visit and finding flags and a sign and a counter. I thought about Claire saying, "We have significant leverage for this negotiation." I went home the back way, a 10-minute detour through county roads that I had been using for 3 days since the gate went up. And I made dinner, and I sat on my porch looking out at my 11 acres in the evening, and I felt, for the first time in 14 months, that I was finally playing the full game rather than just responding to someone else's moves. End of Part 1. Part 2. HOA blocked my legal access road, so I turned every trip into a toll charge nightmare. The injunction hearing was Friday morning. Claire had prepared a concise and thorough submission, the recorded easement, the title documentation showing its existence prior to the development, the history of HOA interference over 14 months, each incident documented with dates and correspondence, and the gate, photographed from 3 angles with a timestamp, standing across a lane on which a recorded easement gave me the right of access. The judge was a man named Judge Robert Ashworth, who handled property matters in the county court and who, Claire told me before the hearing, was known for not having patience with situations that were legally clear being treated as if they were complex. She said, "The law on this is not ambiguous. If Ashworth sees it clearly, and he will, we are going to have a fast hearing." It was fast. The HOA's attorney, Paul Garrett, had been up since early morning preparing arguments, but the arguments available to him were limited by the simplicity of the facts. A recorded easement exists. A gate was installed across it. The gate blocks the easement holder's access. Garrett tried to argue that the gate was a security measure within the HOA's authority as lane maintainers and that I could be provided with a key card. Claire pointed out that no key card had been offered in the 3 days since the gate's installation, despite my clear inability to access my property, and that in any case conditioning easement access on HOA-controlled key cards was itself a restriction on the easement that the HOA did not have authority to impose. Judge Ashworth issued the emergency injunction before noon. The gate was to be removed within 24 hours. The HOA was enjoined from installing any barrier, gate, or obstruction to my easement access pending the full hearing scheduled for 6 weeks later. Claire called me as I was driving back from the courthouse. She said, "The gate is coming down by tomorrow morning." I said, "How did Garrett look?" She said, "Like a man who had advised his client correctly and whose client had not listened." I said, "What happens in 6 weeks?" She said, "The full hearing addresses damages, the easement clarification agreement, and the question of costs. Leonard, I want to tell you something about how the next 6 weeks are likely to go." I said, "Tell me." She said, "The HOA's legal position right now is very bad. They have been found to have illegally blocked a recorded easement. They are facing a damages hearing. They have a utility right-of-way on your property that you have now put them on formal notice about. And the utility contractor has almost certainly called them this morning about the signs and the notice requirement." I said, "The contractor called." She said, "You got a call from the contractor?" I said, "Yesterday afternoon. They said they had received a notice about the right-of-way requirements and wanted to understand the new process." She said, "What did you tell them?" I said, "I told them the recorded terms required 72 hours advance notice and written coordination, and that the administrative fee applied to uncoordinated access. I told them I was happy to work with them on scheduling and that the process was straightforward. I was very pleasant about it." She said, "They contacted the HOA." I said, "I assume so." She said, "Leonard, the HOA is now looking at the following situation: a court order requiring removal of their gate, a damages hearing in 6 weeks, a formal notice about their utility access that is adding administrative complexity and potential cost to their maintenance operations, and a sign on your property with a counter that is visible to every utility crew and maintenance worker who tries to access the right-of-way." I said, "The counter has been useful." She said, "Has anyone tried to access without notice since the sign went up?" I said, "A utility crew showed up yesterday morning. They stopped at the sign. One of them got out and read it. They called someone. They left. They called me 2 hours later to schedule a coordinated access." She said, "They left without accessing." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you invoiced them for the uncoordinated attempt?" I said, "I sent a coordination notice fee invoice for $250 for the uncoordinated access attempt, as specified in the formal notice." Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You sent an invoice for $250 for a utility crew stopping at your sign and leaving." I said, "The right-of-way terms require advance notice. They arrived without notice. The administrative fee applies to uncoordinated access events. Their arrival constituted an access event attempt without coordination." She said, "Leonard." I said, "Is that a legal problem?" She said, "I need to review the specific language of the right-of-way terms again, but based on my recollection of the recording, an access attempt without notice is covered under the coordination requirement. I believe the invoice is supportable." I said, "I have a second one ready." She said, "Has there been a second attempt?" I said, "Not yet. But I have reviewed the HOA's maintenance schedule from the previous 3 years based on when crews have come through. They typically send someone the first week of every month. This is the second week. I expect an attempt soon." She said, "And when they come?" I said, "If they have given 72 hours advance notice in writing and coordinated with me, I will wave them through and there is no fee. If they have not, I will send an invoice." Claire said, "This is going to become part of the negotiation." I said, "I know." She said, "The HOA is going to want to resolve the utility right-of-way issue as part of any settlement." I said, "I know." She said, "That gives you additional leverage in the easement clarification negotiation." I said, I know. She said, you have been thinking about this very carefully. I said, I have had 14 months of practice. The gate came down the next morning. I watched it go from my truck, parked at my end of the lane, as two HOA maintenance workers removed it and loaded it onto a trailer. Neither of them looked in my direction. I did not wave. I drove through the lane for the first time in 4 days, slowly, noting the speed bumps and the narrowed sections and the dark stretch where the lights had been removed. All the things that were still there and that the injunction did not address because they were within the HOA's technical authority. But they would be addressed. That was what the 6 weeks and the full hearing were for. I drove through and went to my property and made coffee and sat on my porch for an hour in the late morning and did nothing except exist on my own land with access to it restored, which was more satisfying than I had expected it to be after only 4 days. I thought about what 14 more months of that, or 14 years, would have felt like. I thought about my Uncle Gerald, who had gotten the easement recorded in the first place as a condition of the development, who had understood that access to his land needed to be protected legally and had done that work before it was needed. I thought about how much easier everything that followed would have been if the HOA had simply read the easement document when I moved in and understood what it said. The negotiation began 10 days after the injunction, not at Claire's instigation, but at Paul Garrett's. He called her on a Monday and said his clients wanted to explore a resolution before the full hearing. Claire called me and said, they want to settle. I said, what changed? She said 3 things. The injunction, which they did not expect to lose so fast. The damages exposure at the full hearing, which their own attorney has presumably told them is significant given 14 months of documented interference. And the utility right of way situation, which has become complicated. I said, complicated how? She said, the HOA board apparently reviewed their utility maintenance records in preparation for the negotiation and discovered that there had been 37 uncoordinated access events over the 9 years you have owned the property. I said, 37. She said, at $250 each, that is $9,250. I had not calculated the historical number. I had been focused on the current and future events. I said, that is the historical liability. She said they also have 6 scheduled maintenance events in the next 2 months that now require the notice and coordination process and potentially the fee if not handled correctly. And the utility contractor has apparently told them that the new process adds administrative complexity to their operations that they are going to pass back to the HOA in their service contract. I said, what are they offering? She said, nothing yet. Garrett opened by saying they want to find a mutually beneficial resolution. That is negotiation language, for we want to know what you want before we commit to anything. I said, Claire, here is what I want, and I want all of it or I go to the full hearing. I laid it out. I had been thinking about it for 10 days, refining it, making sure every piece was specific and achievable. First, the full damages recovery from the gate installation and the 4 days of blocked access, which Claire and I had calculated at the cost of the detour, lost time, and documented inconvenience. Second, recovery of a portion of the costs from the 14 months of interference, specifically the lane modifications that had been targeted at my use. Not all of it. I was realistic about what was provable at hearing, but the costs associated with the most clearly documented incidents. Third, and most importantly, the easement clarification agreement, a recorded county document specifying in precise terms my right of access, the HOA's obligations as lane maintainer, including the requirement to maintain the lane in a condition adequate for my use, the prohibition on any modification that specifically impairs my access, and a damages schedule for future violations. Fourth, the speed bumps reduced to a height within the lower range of the legal limit, rather than the upper range where they currently sat. Fifth, the lane lighting restored to at least its previous level in the sections affecting my access. Sixth, regarding the utility right-of-way, a going-forward agreement that established a clear notice and coordination process that I could comply with without hardship, in exchange for a release of the historical fee liability. The historical 37 events were $9,250 in potential fees. I did not expect to collect all of it. I was using it as a negotiating element. What I wanted in exchange for releasing it was the clarity and the process, not the money. Claire said, "The sixth item is the most important negotiating chip." I said, "I know. It is the one that costs them the most if we don't agree, and it is the one that costs me the least to release if we do." She said, "I will present this to Garrett." The negotiation took 3 weeks. I was not present for most of it, which Claire said was intentional. She said that negotiations where the parties are too close to the situation tend to stall on emotion. She handled it with the efficient precision that I had come to expect from her, and she called me at the end of each significant exchange to update me and get my input before responding. The HOA pushed back on the historical lane modification costs. Claire held firm on the principle and compromised on the amount. They pushed back on the easement clarification language, specifically the damages schedule for future violations. Garrett tried to get the schedule reduced. Claire held firm because the damages schedule was the structural element of the agreement, the thing that gave it teeth, and without it the clarification was just words. They agreed to the full damages schedule in the 3rd week. The speed bumps came down to the lower legal limit. A licensed contractor did the work, and Claire required photo documentation of the measurements before and after. The lighting was restored. 2 new fixtures, better than what had been removed, installed by the HOA at their expense in the sections that had been darkened. The utility right-of-way agreement was the last element resolved, and the one that surprised me most in terms of the HOA's reaction. I had expected them to resist the process requirements. Instead, once the historical liability was on the table and the ongoing fee exposure was clear, they were eager to formalize the process because a clear process with known costs was more manageable than an open-ended liability. The going-forward agreement required 72 hours written notice, a simple coordination form that took 5 minutes to submit, and no fee for compliant access. Non-compliant access retained the $250 fee. The historical liability was released. The easement clarification agreement was drafted, reviewed by both sides, and submitted to the county recorder's office on a Thursday morning 4 weeks after the negotiation began. Claire called me when the recording was confirmed. She said, "Leonard, it is filed." I said, "Tell me what it says." She said, "It says that Leonard Briggs and his successors in title hold an express easement for ingress and egress across Harwick Lane, that the easement is a property right appurtenant to the dominant estate, that the servient estate holder has no authority to condition, restrict, schedule, or otherwise impede the easement holder's access, that the lane must be maintained in a condition adequate for the reasonable use of all users, including the easement holder, that modifications to the lane that specifically impair the easement holder's access are prohibited, and that any interference with the easement shall subject the servient estate to damages in the amounts specified in the schedule attached." She said the damages schedule starts at $5,000 for any obstruction and doubles for each subsequent violation within a 5-year period. I said, "5,000 doubling." She said, "Yes." I said, "That is a number that focuses the mind." She said, "That was the intention." I said, "Claire, how long does a filed county document last?" She said, "It runs with the land. It is permanent. Every future owner of any property in Harwick Estates will take title with knowledge of this document. Every future HOA board will have it in the title chain. It cannot be removed without your consent." I said, "And every future property manager?" She said, "Every future seller Vance, yes." I said, "Good. I want to tell you what the lane looks like now, because it is different from what it was, and the difference is not dramatic, but it is real. The speed bumps are lower, not gone, which I did not require, but at a height that is a reasonable traffic calming measure rather than a targeted inconvenience. I cross them without significant impact at a normal slow speed. The lighting is better. 2 fixtures where there was 1, positioned well, and the section I travel in the evenings is properly lit in a way it has not been since early in my ownership of the property. The lane surface is maintained. The narrowed sections have been corrected, the raised curbing reduced to match the rest of the lane. Claire included lane adequacy in the clarification agreement, and the HOA understands that maintaining it inadequately is a violation of the recorded document. The utility right-of-way runs smoothly. The contractor submits the coordination form on Tuesday for Friday access. I confirm receipt. They come through on Friday morning without incident. The counter on the post has not registered an uncoordinated attempt since the agreement was filed. I have not met Celia Vance since the settlement. She is still the property manager. We have had 2 written communications, both formal, both brief, both professional. The communications are different in tone from the letters she sent before the injunction. They are the communications of someone who has read a county document and understood what it means. The HOA board changed composition at their annual election, which occurred 2 months after the settlement. 3 of the 5 board members who had been in place during the gate installation were replaced by new members who had apparently run specifically on a platform of more measured community management. I know this through Arthur Kimball, who had moved to Harwick Estates 3 years ago and who called me after the election to say the new board's first meeting had included a lengthy discussion of the recorded easement document and what it required. He said, "They read it very carefully, Leonard." I said, "Good." He said, the incoming chair apparently said, and I am quoting, that the previous board had spent 5 years trying to work around a legal right that could not be worked around, and had spent approximately $40,000 in legal fees, maintenance modifications, and settlement costs to learn that lesson. I said, 40,000. He said that was his estimate. He may have been rounding. I said, I spent less than that. He said, significantly less, I imagine. I said, yes. He said, the new chair also said that the easement clarification agreement was going to be included in the HOA's orientation documents for every new board member going forward. I sat with that for a moment, then I said, that is the most useful thing to come out of this. He said that every future board member knows what exists before they make decisions. I said, yes, that is what the whole thing was about, not the gate specifically, not the speed bumps or the lights. The fact that my access is a right and not a negotiation, getting that into a document that every future board will read before they start. He said, you succeeded. I said, yes. He said, was it worth it? I thought about 14 months of speed bumps and narrow lanes and dark sections and letters that did not acknowledge what an easement was. I thought about the morning I found the gate and called Claire and heard her say they have given you leverage. I thought about the sign on the right-of-way entry and the counter on the post and 37 historical events at $250 and $9,250 of negotiating weight. I thought about Judge Ashworth's hearing and the 24-hour removal order and the survey flags and the injunction and the county recording that runs with the land in perpetuity. I said the access was always worth protecting. The question was always how. He said, and the answer. I said, document everything. Find an attorney who understands the specific law. Use the leverage that exists. And when someone gives you an opening by doing something clearly illegal, be ready to use it to achieve something permanent. He said, you built something permanent. I said, I reinforced something that was already there. The easement was always permanent. I just made sure everyone knew it. I drive the lane every day, twice a day at minimum, more often when work requires. I cross the speed bumps at a reasonable speed, and the lights are on in the evenings, and the surface is adequate, and the gate is gone, and in its place is empty lane all the way to the county road, clear and open and mine to use as my household requires. My uncle Gerald got the easement recorded in 1993 because he understood that access to his land needed to be a legal right and not an arrangement. He did not know when he did it that the land would eventually be mine or that the development around it would eventually try to block what he had established. He just knew that you protect what matters with the right documents. I have added to those documents. The clarification agreement sits in the county records next to the original easement recording, one from 1993 and one from this year, both permanent, both running with the land, both reading to any future owner or board or property manager as clearly and unambiguously as anything written in property law can read. The lane is mine to use. It has always been mine to use. Now everyone knows it. The counter on the right-of-way post still works. I have not needed it in months. I leave it there anyway. Some things are worth having even when you are not using them. Just so everyone remembers that you know how.